Welcome to a special interview on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. Dr. Gad Saad is a professor of marketing at Concordia University and a trailblazer in applying evolutionary psychology to consumer behaviour. He's the best-selling author of the book The Parasitic Mind, a fearless critique of ideological extremism, and also the host of the popular YouTube series The Saad Truth. Loved by his fans for his wit and championing of reason and science, and perhaps equally loathed by his critics who disagree with his takes on society and politics. Dr. Saad is a fierce advocate for free speech and intellectual freedom. Dr. Saad, thank you for making time and joining us here on Counterpoints.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for having me.
You published The Parasitic Mind back in 2020, but it's still being talked about and critiqued across multiple platforms as if it's a new release. Why do you think it continues to resonate with readers?
I think it's because many of the parasitic ideas that I discuss in the book, and I'd be happy to expand on why I use the term parasitic, still hold true today. Many people thought that with the victory of Donald Trump, many of these ideological parasitic ideas would somehow cease to exist. But it took between 50 to 100 years for these ideas to proliferate, first in academia and then in every nook and cranny of society. So it's going to take a lot more than just Donald Trump coming for a second term for all of this nonsense to disappear. So I think that's why it's still so relevant.
So do you think that you could be in for another 50 to 100 years of people expanding on your psychology then, for you to, or for society to maybe come back to what you would consider a sense of normalcy?
I mean, I'd like to think, fingers crossed, I'd hope to think that it won't take as long to eradicate those ideas. And maybe it might be worthwhile for your viewers and listeners to get a sense of what I mean by parasitic ideas. So, for example, postmodernism, which is a philosophical framework that was developed in academia, say about 50 years ago, purports that there are no objective truths. Everything is shackled by subjectivity. Everything is shackled by idiosyncrasies, by personal biases. Well, if there are no objective truths, that's how you can get up is down, left is right, war is peace, slavery is freedom, men are women, women are men, because there are no objective metrics by which we can judge reality. Cultural relativism is another idea pathogen, which basically says, who are you to judge the conduct of people in other cultures? You don't have the right to do that. Social constructivism is another idea pathogen. It basically says that we are born with empty minds. We don't have biological imperatives, and it's only socialization that makes us who we are. So this cocktail of departure from reason has led us down the abyss of infinite lunacy. So hopefully it won't take 50 to 100 years to redress the ship. But as I said, it'll take a lot more than an anti-woke president to set things straight.
So one of the first parasitic thoughts you mentioned there is around truth. And the quest for truth is something that you talk about a lot. You call yourself a truth defender. Is truth ever subjective? Are there instances when you accept that your version of the truth could differ from my version of the truth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends what kinds of, epistemologically speaking, which types of truths we're talking about. It may be true that I prefer Japanese food and you prefer Mexican food. Now, that is based on a sensorial aesthetic preference, so that truth can be subjective. But is it true that on average men are taller than women and heavier than women? That is an absolute, incontrovertible biological truth, even though your Aunt Jenny is taller than your Uncle Roscoe. It is a truth, right? 2 + 2 is equal to 4. My background is in mathematics. There are axiomatic truths that are inviolable. So no, we're not always shackled by subjectivity. By the way, you couldn't get up as a scientist in the morning to do your work if you didn't think that there were objective truths to be discovered in the natural world. Now, truth can change in science, right? What was true 300 years ago, we've revised it. So there are provisional truths, but epistemologically speaking, there has to be truths. Otherwise, all scientists are wasting their time.
Where do you think this idea of fake news plays into the idea of truth then? It's almost as if now we have politicians, and if they don't like the way that perhaps something's being phrased or something's put to them, they just call it fake news. Are they distorting truth?
Right. Well, there are all sorts of ways by which people who are in power seek to eradicate those pesky other folks who might be attacking their foundational ideas, right? And so in the worst case scenarios, we kill people who don't think like us. In the West, luckily, we're not quite there yet. So we come up with other mechanisms. If you say something that I don't like, it's hate speech. If you say something that I don't like, it's misinformation, it's disinformation, it's fake news. And so I've challenged people. So for example, when someone comes out with some idea about settled science, I will repost or retort by saying, which is the true statement? Can men menstruate or can men not menstruate? And usually they run away. And so the idea that there are absolute settled science truths is a very dangerous idea. What's beautiful about science is that it is always autocorrective. We're always seeking to better approach truth. So anybody who tells you that they have a complete hold on what is true or not is probably a fan of Orwellian reality.
When you talk about hard truths maybe in society, what do you think are some of the hardest truths that society is having trouble swallowing these days?
So that's a great question. My original idea of writing The Parasitic Mind came to me nearly 30 plus years ago when I first finished my PhD and I was trying to incorporate biology into an understanding of human nature. I was shocked to see that so many of my social scientist colleagues thought that I was insane. How dare you argue, Professor Saad, that human beings are shaped by biological forces? Apparently, biological forces apply to every species on Earth except one species called human beings. That's insane, right? I mean, somehow when you are a consumer, you know you are no longer purview to your biological imperatives. And so this is probably, at least in my academic career, has been the most difficult thing for my academic colleagues to swallow, namely that we are not just a cultural animal, we're also a biological animal.
Do you believe in nature versus nurture? Is it one or the other, or is it a mix of the both?
It's exactly what you just said. And I mean, what you just said when you said it's a mix of both. Actually, that's called the interactionist framework. If you start and you want to bake a cake, before you bake the cake, each of the ingredients are separated. There's the butter, there's the sugar, there's the flour, and so on. Once I bake the cake, if I were to tell you, please point me to where the eggs are or where the sugar is, you wouldn't be able to, because now it's been baked into this inextricable mix called the cake. So for most human phenomena, we are an inextricable mix of our biology and our environment. It is both nature and nurture. But I should just add one more point. Nurture exists in its form because of nature. So yes, it is true that men and women are socialized into their roles, but they are socialized into those roles precisely because of biological imperatives. So it doesn't exist outside of biology. We are taught what we are taught because of biology.
Staying with biological imperatives, as you call them, why do you think that the subject of gender has generated such an impassioned response from people on either side of the argument? Why is it that one issue that seems to be the topic that people can't get past or continue to go back to?
There are several answers to that, but I'll start with one manifestation of what you're asking. So take, for example, equity feminism. equity feminism is a great idea. It basically says that there should be no institutional reasons under the law why men and women should be treated differently. They should be equal under the law. Based on that definition of feminism, most of us would say, yeah, sign me up. I'm an equity feminist. Then radical feminists come along and say, well, in the service of squashing any sexism in society, let us now promulgate the idea that men and women are indistinguishable creatures. There is nothing that men could do in a superior way to women or vice versa. All sex differences must be due to social construction. And therefore, by promulgating this idea, hopefully it will allow us to battle sexism in society. Well, I always remind people that in the service of a noble goal, we don't murder and rape truth. So I can walk and chew gum at the same time. I can be all for equality of the sexes while also recognizing that men and women do have evolved sex differences.
Why does it matter to you or to me how someone else identifies? Isn't that an issue for them and not an issue for us?
Yes, great. So I'm assuming you mean, for example, transgender issues, right?
Indeed.
Gender ideology. Yes. So I went up in front of the Canadian Senate to give some expert testimony in 2017. At the time, Canada was debating a bill called Bill C-16 that sought to incorporate gender identity and gender expression under the rubric of hate speech laws. And I said, look, to your point, I believe that anybody should live free of bigotry and have a dignified life. And so sign me up for that laudable goal. But again, in the service of that noble goal, we don't get to murder and rape truth. So identify however way you want. That doesn't mean that I need to put gender pronouns next to my bio. Because until 15 minutes ago, the 117 billion people who had existed on Earth seem to have been able to very easily navigate through the conundrum of identifying who is male or female. But it's only 15 minutes ago that a bearded guy who's 6'4", 280 pounds has to put he, him next to his because he doesn't want to marginalize some transgender person. So I can be both very socially progressive whilst ensuring that I don't murder and rape truth.
So an offshoot of the quest for truth is your assertion of the importance of being able to admit you're wrong. Do you think world leaders, as equally as your average person on the street today, has a problem with admitting when they're wrong? And if so, why? Why is it so hard for us?
I'm smiling because it reminds me of a question that I was asked by a British psychiatrist. I had appeared on his show maybe a year ago, and he was the first host to ever ask me the following question. He said to me, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have his exact words. He said to me, what is the singular, most surprising phenomenon that you have witnessed in your study of human nature and human behavior in the 30 plus years that you've been a professor? And so I paused for a minute, and then to your question, Melinda, I said, probably the inability of people to change their opinions once it is anchored, irrespective of how much information I might throw at them. And so to your point, I think it's a regrettable feature of the architecture of the human mind that people never wish to admit that they're wrong, or very few people wish to admit that they're wrong. And actually, there's a great book, and maybe I should start charging them some royalties for being such a promoter of their book. There's a book by Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier titled, these are two French psychologists. The book is titled The Enigma of Reason. In the book, they argued that our ability to reason did not evolve to seek some objective truth, but rather it evolved to win arguments. So as I provide you with evidence, hopefully to change your opinion, your reflex is to go, la, 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 I don't want to hear it because I don't want to lose the argument. So I think it's a very, very challenging and difficult task. Never mind to change the mind of world leaders, to change the mind of my local, barber. So that's the challenge that I face every day in the public arena.
What about challenging yourself in the regard of when's the last time you have admitted you're wrong or maybe changed your opinion? Do you equally find it as difficult as someone who's studied this for their career?
I mean, it's tough to answer this question because it's going to seem as though I'm engaging in ego defensiveness myself. I'd like to think that if I am a objective truth defender, that if incoming information comes in that invalidates my positions, I will be more than happy to readily admit that it's time to autocorrect. But by the way, I do that every time that I test a hypothesis in my scientific work. I've had many papers that I've published where the final findings turned out to be contradictory to what I had hypothesized at the start. So if I am an honest academic and an honest scientist, it has to be baked into my epistemology that I'm open to change.
Well, if and when that ever happens, I hope you come back onto Counterpoints and tell us all about it. Do you think the denial of truth, this ability to admit that maybe our opinions are flawed, has played a role in the polarizing nature of party politics that we're seeing these days? Republicans versus Democrats, the Remain versus the Brexiteers. It's almost become a team sport. Can we no longer admit that the other side has something that we could benefit from?
Yes, regrettably, yes. And I would even add a more pessimistic bent to what you just asked. Oftentimes, when you demonstrate to someone that their position is incorrect and you present them with evidence to the contrary, that only solidifies their position. So, I mean, imagine how disheartening that is, right? You'd like to think that if you take position A and I show you that it actually should be not A, that if you're an honest interlocutor, you'd say, okay, fair enough. Maybe I need to change my opinion. No, you will even be more emboldened in your position. So that's I mean, one of the things that is both exciting about the work that I do, but also so disheartening, is that when I engage people on social media, oftentimes I quickly realize that irrespective of how much information I share, I could never move them an inch, which is exactly the reason, Melinda, why I often refuse to debate certain folks. It's not because I'm too afraid to debate them, but I know it's a futile exercise. We're just going to talk past each other and no one is going to move 1 millimeter. So what's the point of engaging you?
All right, well, looking ahead to your next book then, coming out, it's called Suicidal Empathy. I'm not sure if that's the full title or an abridged version. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Thank you for that question. So in the Parasitic Mind, I argued that our cognitive system could be parasitized, could be zombified. Our cognitive system is just a fancy way of saying our ability to think. But we are both a thinking and feeling animal. And therefore, suicidal empathy completes the story and says, here is what happens when our emotional system is hijacked. And I use empathy as the key value here because while empathy is a beautiful value to hold, right? We are a social species. It makes perfect sense that we be empathetic to the people that we are interacting with. Aristotle explained to us more than 2,000 years ago that all good things in the right amount, at the right place, in the right measure. So empathy is good, but when it targets the right people at the right measure and so on. Suicidal empathy is where you become so orgiastic in your meting out of empathy that it no longer serves a valuable objective. And so let me, if I may, draw an analogy. When I scan the environment for environmental threats, that makes perfect evolutionary sense. So for example, if I have the pleasure of meeting you, Melinda, and in person, and I notice that you just sneezed into your hand and then you put out your hand to shake my hand, I realize, oh boy, I better go and wash my hands after I finish shaking the hand of the lovely Melinda because she may have a cold. That makes evolutionary sense. If I then spend 8 hours in the bathroom because I have germ contamination, what started off as an adaptive reflex becomes maladaptive, and it's called obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So when an adaptive process misfires, it becomes dysfunctional. That's my argument in suicidal empathy. Empathy is great when it is properly regulated. It becomes really problematic when it becomes dysregulated.
And I know that you've admitted in interviews in the past that you're a bit of a germphobe, so I won't take offence that you spend 8 hours washing your hands after I sneeze. Can you give me an example in modern society of where you think you see suicidal empathy?
Right. So we can break it up either in domestic policy or foreign policy. Let me give you one or two, say, from domestic policy. To argue that all illegal immigrants have a right to experience, the United States liberties is a form of suicidal empathy. To say that MS-13 gang members should be more worthy of our empathy than American vets who might have lost limbs defending the liberties of the United States is probably suicidal empathy. To argue, for example, that all immigrants are equal in their proclivity to be able to assimilate into a host nation is suicidal empathy. That's simply bafflingly untrue, right? There are some cultures that are more aligned with the values of the host society than others. And to recognize that doesn't make you bigoted. It makes you someone that has a functioning brain. And so again, the reflex to be endlessly orgiastically empathetic, while it might make me feel good in the moment, it has some really dangerous downstream effects.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to truth and freedom of speech. You're a free speech absolutist, I think, if I'm interpreting that correctly. Are you concerned about threats to free speech, either from censorship or self-censorship? Do you think there should be any limits to free speech? And is self-censorship becoming more of an issue than perhaps an overarching censorship by the government?
Right. So let me start first by what I mean by an absolutist stance on freedom of speech. I'm Jewish. I grew up in the Middle East. I've had some very difficult realities in my childhood because we had to escape Lebanon. So I'm very much wedded to my Jewish identity. Yet I support the right of Holocaust deniers to spew their nonsense. There's almost nothing that could be as insulting and offensive as to deny the Holocaust. But if you wish to live in a free society, you have to be able to bear the imbeciles, the racists, the bigots. Where I draw the line as to what constitutes freedom of speech is already what's enshrined in the First Amendment, which is there can't be a direct incitement to violence. So I can perfectly say Judaism is one crock of nonsense. It's all garbage. And I would say, I support your right to say that. On the other hand, if you say, let's go on the corner of Broadway and 7th Street, and when the Jews are coming out of the synagogue, let's beat them up and kill them, then that becomes direct incitement to violence, and you're not allowed to do that. But you can criticize any ideology, any belief systems. You can be scornful. You could mock it. You could satirize it. That's the price you pay to be in a free society. Regarding your other point about self-censorship, I exactly agree with you. The greatest threat to freedom of speech in the West doesn't come from the government. It comes from creating a zeitgeist that causes people to self-regulate, right? So when the student says, I don't feel comfortable saying that I like Donald Trump in a classroom because maybe my professor will downgrade me on my essay. That's the danger, right? So I don't think in the West the danger comes from, the big Orwellian big brother stopping us from speaking, but if you create an environment where people are afraid to express themselves freely, then the fascists have won the game.
There's a recent example that I want to get your take on. I'm sure, as I'm sure you've seen, you're very active across social media. Kanye West, or Ye, has released a new song titled Heil Hitler. Do you think it was wrong for Spotify and other platforms to ban it, or do you think it should have been allowed online?
Now I'm going to get tons of hatred from fellow Jews who are going to say, how dare you? I think that fits under my free speech absolutism, right? Is it grotesque? Yes. Do I wish that he wouldn't glorify Hitler? Yes. In a free society, do we have to tolerate imbeciles? Yes. And so, and from my perspective, I support the right of him to be an idiot.
You said you'll probably get a lot of feedback on it. You've gained a lot of notoriety and publicity thanks to your image as this controversial thinker who's not afraid to say exactly the truth as you see it. Do you like that image of yourself? Is that notoriety part of what drives you now?
It's a fair question for you to ask, but absolutely not. What drives me is the following. I have a very exacting code of personal conduct. I'm my worst critic. Therefore, when I go to bed at night and I put my head on the pillow, the only thing that stops me from having insomnia is to know that I never modulated in my defense of truth. My mother told me many, many years ago when I was a young man, she told me, you know, Gad, the quicker that you realize that the world doesn't abide to your purity bubble, the happier you'll be. Well, guess what? What drives me is perhaps a naive perspective on living in a purity bubble. And so if I were to stop from speaking, then I would feel as though I'm fraudulent. I would feel as though I'm a charlatan. So I don't do what I do because I get the ego strokes of being notorious and famous. I do what I do because if I don't, then I would consider myself to be a fraud.
Okay, well, let's put some of those famous views to some current global events, because there's a lot of things happening that I'm sure our viewers, your viewers, will be interested to get your take on. You've spoken and written at length about intellectual terrorism, as you call it, on university campuses. So as a self-proclaimed free speech absolutist, how do you feel about the current US administration's crackdown on student protests?
So again, if the student protests are, we think that this particular policy by this foreign government is wrong, go at it, have fun. If that means that Jewish students are afraid to walk to class, or they can't walk to class because there are blockades, if they feel harassed, intimidated, and so on, then that crosses the line into incitement to violence. I've said this before, but I'm happy to repeat it. I took a leave of absence from my home university in Montreal, and I'm currently a visiting professor at Northwood University in Michigan, because it became quite dangerous for me to be at my home university. This is not happening in Yemen or in North Korea or in Chinese communists in the 1950s. It's happening in Montreal, Canada. That's probably not a good thing. So protest as much as you want because we believe in free speech. That doesn't give you the right to infringe on the rights of others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Elon Musk is a fan of yours. He went all in with Trump's campaign, taking on responsibility for cutting government waste, for example. But there was some considerable backlash, and now it seems as if he's pulled back a little bit. How do you think that history, society will remember his involvement in politics in Trump's second term?
I'll answer that in a second, but I went on record as soon as I had found out that Elon was going to purchase what was then Twitter. I went on my channel and I produced a clip where I said, of all things that Elon Musk has done or will ever do, none will be remotely as consequential as him having done that, because he has allowed a proliferation of voices, including mine, that would have been, if not silenced, much lesser amplified had he, and I know this for a fact because until he came along, my reach was lesser. I mean, it was big, but it was lesser than after he, unleashed freedom. In terms of his politics, look, I think from the perspective of someone who's written The Parasitic Mind, I wholeheartedly supported the fact that he went all in on Donald Trump because Donald Trump, for better or worse, whether you like him or not, is very much anti-woke. And there is nothing in life that is as dangerous as a parasitized mind. So the fact that, for example, I no longer apply for research grants because I'm not willing to give diversity, inclusion, and equity statements as part of my application, that doesn't bode well for science. And so I'm thrilled that he chose the right candidate. But as I said, the most important thing that Elon Musk will ever do is his staunch defense of freedom as per his purchase of X.
You've said that he deserves a Nobel Prize for his purchase of X. Is that just a Nobel Prize for someone who has a lot of money and can splash it around so that he can have the things he wants to hear on his own platform?
I mean, I wouldn't say that the Nobel Prize is just for having purchased X, but certainly for having promoted a proliferation of ideas. And but in that sense, yes, you're right that came about through his purchasing X. Look, from a straight commercial economic perspective, many people were saying that he was an idiot for having purchased X at the price that he did. So one could argue that commercially speaking and economically speaking, he took a huge hit in order to do that, which exactly proves the purity of his objectives, which is notwithstanding the fact that he knew that he would lose a lot of money potentially, that he would create a lot of enemies. That has turned out to be true. He was willing to put his neck out. And so from that perspective, he certainly deserves it much more than Prophet Barack Obama.
Donald Trump won his historic term despite legal woes, despite being no stranger to controversy. Why do you think that he was a more appealing choice to people rather than Kamala Harris?
Well, first, because Kamala Harris is a lobotomized fool that can't complete a sentence, so that could certainly have something to do with it. But beyond that, I think that most people had had enough with having to nod politely when a 6'4" male was sharing the locker room with their 12-year-old daughter, right? And so, common sense has a way of catching up to all of your ideological capture at some point. And so to the extent that Donald Trump was a exemplar of a return to reality, a return to common sense, most people said, look, I've had enough with, and I mean, I keep saying the transgender issue, but it's hardly only that, right? There are many, many other issues. For example, Kamala Harris was, I mean, even though she didn't call herself that, she is an avowed communist in her ethos. When she says we have to create policies whereby all people end up at the same place, that is literally the definition of socialism/communism. No, we don't have to end up at the same place. We should start with equal opportunities, but that doesn't mean that we all have equal talents, equal ambition. Some of us are taller, shorter, better looking, less better looking. And so E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard biologist, when he was famously asked about his views on communism, he said, great idea, wrong species. And he studied social ants. Ants are communistic, human beings are not. And the United States is a capitalist country, so it doesn't surprise me that most people said, given those two choices, I'm going to go with Trump over lobotomized Kamala.
The almost exact opposite seemed to have happened in your home country, in Canada. What did you make of this apparent dramatic turnaround of the fortunes of the Liberal Party, reportedly as a direct reaction to the rhetoric of Donald Trump?
Well, what an amazing question. Thank you for that. I think if I can tie it back to an earlier segment that we were chatting where I said it is so difficult to get people to change their opinions, Canadians perfectly exemplify that, right? So they had one mandate under Justin Trudeau, and most people complained that it was disastrous. So then they went to the ballot box and said, hey, let's vote for Justin Trudeau a second time. And then when that happened, they said, here's a great idea. Let's put him back in power for a third time. And when that ended, let's bring the next guy who is just Justin Trudeau in what appears to be a slightly less woke skin. And so I was baffled by it, but perhaps not surprised in that, and not to be critical of Pierre Poilievre, I think that uh, he didn't do all that he could have done, which resulted in him losing. I can't remember what the exact numbers were. I think he was ahead by 30 points or whatever it was, some insurmountable lead, and then he lost it. It speaks precisely to our earlier point. Once people commit to a particular course of action, it's difficult to dislodge them. And I'll just mention one other thing. I will often be approached by fans on the street and they'll say, "Oh, I love your work. I love everything you stand for." And then I'll look at them politely and say, "So who did you vote for?" "Oh, Professor Saad, I voted for the Liberal Party, of course." I say, "But do you realize that almost every position that you're saying that you support in me is contrary to that of the Liberal Party?" And then they sort of scratch their heads. It speaks to the fact that most people don't necessarily put in all of the cognitive effort when they're casting their votes.
Can it not be viewed the other way, though, that if you looked at the polls, yes, the opposition had this insurmountable lead. People were going to vote for him, but then they did have the ability to change course, to change their mind, because they didn't like the way that that was going?
I mean, of course, I don't have the empirical evidence to counter what you just said, but certainly from the anecdotal evidence that I have from interacting with many people who come up to me and chat with me and so on, I didn't get the sense that what you said is what was happening. But who knows? We'd have to let the political scientists test that hypothesis.
I'm sure that they will. All right, on the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, as Jews in Lebanon, your family was displaced and forced to flee during the civil war in the 70s. So how do you view President Trump's plan to then displace Palestinians from Gaza to build what he calls the Riviera in the region?
Yeah, I'm not sure if the optics of how he went about it is going to make a lot of people in the region happy. So I might have chosen a slightly different stylistic approach, but that's what Donald Trump does. Look, in an ideal world, I would love for both peoples to coexist. That's only going to happen when both people recognize the right of the other to exist on that land. From my perspective, as a Jewish person who had to wear some really good running shoes to outrun those who wanted to do bad things to me, I know where the lack of acceptance of the other comes from. Once all peoples in that region say, "I want a world where my neighbor can exist," it will unleash a new era in the Middle East that is absolutely unbelievable. And I'm glad to see that many of the Gulf countries, by the way, are starting to demonstrate that reality, right? I mean, if you see Saudi Arabia, if you see Dubai, if you see Abu Dhabi, you're seeing a real rapprochement with Israel. And so, inshallah, as we say, we will see some love flowing in the Middle East soon.
We're almost out of time. I just have two questions for you. One parasitic thought that you highlight is this idea of ostrich syndrome, burying your head in the sand. Like you were saying, la, 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 I don't want to hear it. There are many people and many international organisations accusing Israel of genocide and starvation in Gaza. Do you see this ostrich syndrome as the behaviour of some of Israel's ardent supporters?
You mean in the sense that those Israeli supporters are denying a reality that the other camp is saying? Is that what you mean?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Look, have there been an untold number of people killed? Yes. Is it tragic when any innocent person dies on either side of the aisle? Absolutely, yes. That said, when the Hamas directory comes out with their casualty figures, it may not be a manifestation of ostrich parasitic syndrome to maybe question the veracity of their data, right? And so it is undoubtedly probably true what you're saying, which is some people on the Israeli side are not going to be willing to accept any evidence that is contrary to their narrative. But I would also urge people to realize that maybe the other side is not always fully accurate when they report their data.
And again, just to balance that question out, on the flip side, there are probably supporters of the Palestinian cause of Hamas who are equally not willing to see the Israeli side. Is it a bit of a case of one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist?
I mean, there is a bit of that. And it's also, look, I was mentioning earlier about empathy and misguided empathy and suicidal empathy. One of the ways that you really are able to do horrible things to the other, irrespective of who is in camp A or camp B, is to lose your ability to empathize with the other, because then that allows me to do horrible things to the other, right? And I'll give you a good example that actually I discuss in my forthcoming book. So you're getting some preview, some
Great news.
exclusive
We love that
content.
on Counterpoints. Give us an exclusive, Dr. Saad.
There you go. Do you remember when in, I think it was maybe 2014, I can't remember the exact date, but I do have the reference in the book, where there were, I think, 1,500 Shia Iraqis that were being led in a long, orderly queue by ISIS, and they were being summarily executed. Well, when I watched that clip, I was filled with rage. Why? Because I didn't see those Shia Muslims as my enemy. I saw them as human beings, and I just couldn't believe that one set of human beings can do that to another set of human beings, right? And therefore, I had the right empathy in my heart to recognize that it didn't matter that they were Shia Muslim or Sunni Muslim. Anytime someone innocent is being killed in such a grotesque way, they are deserving of my empathy. And so what I'd love to see is for the Israelis to recognize that when the other side feels pain, we should empathize with them, and vice versa. And if we can get that, then we can find our common humanity.
Well, on that positive, optimistic note, let's end on some happiness. You wrote a book called The Saad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets to Leading a Good Life. It was one of your earlier books. To round out our conversation, what is the most important rule to happiness for you?
And it's not because she's within earshot. I would say that choosing the right spouse is certainly going to, give you a heads up or headway in terms of climbing Mount Happiness. Because if every morning I wake up next to a person and I look and I go, oh God, not her again, that's probably not going to make me happy. But if I wake up next to that person and go, yes, what have I done in life that I can deserve to wake up to such an angel, then I'm probably going to have a good day. So I would say choosing the right spouse and choosing the right profession that gives you purpose and meaning, which certainly the profession that I have chosen has given me that purpose and meaning, is one of the reasons why I'm referred to as the happy warrior, and I always have a smile on my face.
Well, whether people agree or disagree with you, I think that is one topic that people can get behind. I think that's a wonderful way to finish our conversation. It's been really interesting to get your thoughts, to challenge you on some topics, and to have your really unique perspective. Dr. Gad Saad, evolutionary behavioural scientist and author, thank you for your time here on Counterpoints on Al Arabiya English.
Thank you so much. It was a delightful conversation. Thank you so much.
And as always, thank you to you at home for joining us on this special Counterpoints interview. You can, of course, catch all our debates on Al Arabiya English on our YouTube channel and follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you next time.